Last time on Weirder After Dark, we met the serial killer Jane Toppan. We learned about her tragic beginnings where we found ourselves feeling sympathy and sadness for her, but went on to learn that as Jane ventured out into the world, it was there she attempted to become a nurse and tapped into her truly evil and sadistic side. Jane admitting to killing over 100 victims ranging from nameless patients in hospital wards to people she considered family and her closest friends. Jane goes to be charged with 11 murders, and as our story ended last week, we ended with murder victim number 10, her dear friend Minnie Gibbs.
Welcome back to Weirder After Dark, the podcast we get into everything New England weird. My name is Sean, and I'm here with my two co-hosts.
I am Chris.
And I'm Kathy.
And we are going to be wrapping up the killer Jane Toppan story here today. But before we do that, we wanted to go ahead and plug something really quick, something super exciting. For the last couple weeks, we've been asking for some listener tales, and you delivered.
We have them.
New England is definitely weird.
Yeah, facts.
We got some very interesting stories.
New England's got some weird shit going on out there, and we are so excited to share them with you. It'll be dropping, I think we've landed on the Friday after Christmas, right? Is that where we landed?
I think that's what we decided.
All right. Get pumped up and get ready for what we're dubbing Whispers After Dark. Weird stories from the gang. Mm-hmm. The gang being you.
Could we say that it would be gang related then?
Ooh, it is a little gang related.
It is gang related. It is.
It is. We'll skip some of the banter here today. We'll just get right back into the story of Jane Toppan, our infamous killer. You ready, Kathy?
I'm ready.
Let's do it.
At this point, our hero in this story is Minnie's father-in-law, Captain Gibbs, who had some suspicion and had a gut feeling about Jane and decided he wasn't going to let this go ignored. He was going to kind of keep pushing to find out what's going on. So Captain Gibbs is having a conversation with the family physician, Dr. Latter, and kind of recapping Minnie's last days. And he shares with the doctor that he witnessed Jane giving Minnie an injection that Jane had told him was prescribed by the doctor. And it was at this point that the doctor tells the captain, nah, I didn't prescribe any injections.
It's about time somebody catches on to this. Like, Captain Gibbs is like my hero at this point. It's like, come on, somebody has to catch on.
This is also like the 30th time. There's always been like doctors around, other nurses around, and finally, years later, someone's finally like, wait, this is weird.
This is weird. And it took Jane, I think, being overly confident and a little cocky to slip up, and then someone saying, no, this isn't okay, and having that conversation.
It's almost like every time she commits a murder, she's a little bit more emboldened. She takes a little bit more risk. There's a little less time in between the murders. So she seems to be on this path.
I feel like that's on par too. Where I work, I'm a teacher, and whenever I see the people that I teach make mistakes, it's never in the beginning when they're first learning or first doing something. It's always when they just get a little bit too confident and they're feeling good. They start cutting corners, trying to do a little bit too much. That's when the mistakes happen. And right here, Jane, this is where you made your mistake.
If Jane had just not killed Minnie, she could have just kept on going.
And this is the fourth family member in a month, right?
In a month, in 41 days.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
It's wiped out the entire family.
She took out an entire family in 41 days. She's like riding that edge.
Yeah. So at the same time that Captain Gibbs is talking with Dr. Latter, there was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Cushing who, just prior to Alden Davis's death, had ridden the train with Alden Davis. So Alden Davis was the husband, the father of the family she just wiped out. And Dr. Cushing thought that it was really suspicious that this man he saw was on the train, he was healthy, he was fine, to just suddenly up and die. But Dr. Cushing didn't really know Captain Gibbs. So he wanted to kind of figure out how to approach this. So he had a friend, Captain Ed Robinson, and he reached out to him and said, you're a captain. Captain Gibbs is a captain. This might make broaching this conversation a little bit easier. You guys will have that in common. So he kind of uses him as the bridge to go up and introduce himself and have this conversation.
Can I just say, that's a big ask. Like, I hope they're really tight with the captain and the doctor, because how do you ask him, say, hey, could you ask your other captain buddy if your entire family was murdered?
I don't really think that he was asking the captain to have that conversation. I think he was using the fact that they were both captains as a way to kind of start a conversation. Dr. Cushing would then have the conversation with Captain Gibbs and say, I saw Alden Davis on the train and he seemed in good health. This is really weird. So he kind of used, my friend's a captain, you're a captain, let's talk. Does that make sense?
That makes more sense then.
Yeah. Although Captain Gibbs agreed that there was reason to suspect Jane, there was still no evidence. Then tragedy hits. And a few days later, after Minnie's death, Dr. Latter died of natural causes. And there's no one to support the captain's claim regarding the injections.
No way.
Yeah.
Actual natural causes?
Yeah.
Supposedly,
Okay.
yes.
What a turn of events. Finally gets caught in the act. Life isn't fucked.
So Captain Gibbs contacts two friends, Dr. Leonard Wood and his brother Edward Wood, a professor of pathology at Harvard Medical. They discuss the deaths, and although Alden and Maddie could be written off as reasonable because they were older, the death of the two daughters didn't make sense. Both women were healthy and had no medical issues prior to falling suddenly ill. With a suspicion and the captain's word that the doctor didn't order the injections, the captain went to the state police, and General Whitney was assigned to the case. So he actually goes to the police, says, I just have a suspicion. This is what it is, lays it all out, and the Massachusetts State Police at the time was like, all right, we're going to look into this. Feeling strongly that there was a reason to suspect Jane and not wanting her to be on their own, they had a detective, John Patterson, follow her and keep track of her every move. So meanwhile, as this is happening, the police are closing in on Jane and they're working to get the bodies of the four Davis families exhumed. Jane goes and visits Genevieve's father-in-law to find out what people are thinking of the deaths. So to me, this is a clear sign that Jane knows murdering all of these people is not okay, and she's getting worried. Yet, after talking to Genevieve's father-in-law, she leaves that family home feeling safe and that it's okay to continue to kill because that's what she does. She then returned to her childhood home in Lowell, Massachusetts, where she was hoping to once again get to marry O.A. She still has in her mind, she's going to get to marry him, she's going to get his inheritance. But unfortunately, O.A. had a sister that showed up, Edna Bannister. Now, she was on her way to New York to the World's Fair, and O.A. invited her to stay at the house. Well, Jane couldn't have O.A.'s sister staying at the house. Another female in his life was not okay with her. And this was someone that if O.A. should die, she would get the inheritance. So Jane was left with no choice, in Jane's mind, but to kill his sister. As Edna was slowly being poisoned, General Whitney actually arrives at the house to talk to Jane about the death of the Davis family, since she was the one to take care of them. So Jane goes on and explains to General Whitney her version of the story. After she gets done, she uses the excuse that it was the summer heat. Alden and Maddie, they were old, they had illnesses. Genevieve, she kind of sticks with the suicide attempt. Minnie, it's a broken heart. General Whitney asks Jane if she thinks that an autopsy should have been performed. And it goes that Jane asked O.A. And O.A., of course, is like, well, sure. Rule out any suspicion, make sure we know exactly how they died and what's going on. She was then asked if she agreed, and she said no. She didn't think that there was any reason to have any autopsies done or anything like that. As this conversation's happening, Edna is in the other room, literally dying because Jane is poisoning her. Edna eventually dies, and Jane is now focused back on O.A. And in her mind, she decides, I'm going to slowly poison him, take care of him, make him better, and it's going to cause him to fall in love with me. He's going to see what a good person I am.
Am I hearing this right? So she's being questioned about all these deaths in one room, and then in the next room, she's got her next victim that she's slowly poisoning.
She's slowly poisoning.
That is vindictive.
Was any of this like linked? You're talking to Jane, you're asking some questions. Like, did it get broadened up that like Edna's sick in another room? Because like, what a red flag, right? Like,
there's somebody coughing in there. Are they okay?
Well, again, you have to remember too, I don't know for sure what stage of the poisoning, but she would start it off with sometimes it would just be gastrointestinal upset. So maybe she just felt nauseous and she had diarrhea. And
gotcha. It might not have been like sick yet.
Yeah. So, I mean, all I know is that Edna at that time is currently being poisoned by Jane. So Now, poor Edna, just because she's Owe's sister and stopped on the way to say hi on her way to the World Fair, she's dead.
No extra stops, people. Just get to where you're
just
going.
Go where you're going.
No extra stops.
After the death of Edna, Jane sets her eyes back on Owe, and in her mind, she decided it was a good idea to slowly poison him and tend to him and care for him. This is known because it was documented. And before I say it, it's a little confusing because in some cases, Owe is referred to as Owe, but then she also sometimes refers to him as Mr. Bigham. And throughout the storytelling, I've always referred to him as Owe, but they are one and the same. He is Owe Brigham.
A little over-explained.
Yeah, that's how names work.
Yes. The plan instantly came to me to give Owe a little poison, a morphia tablet in his tea, just enough to make him sick. And then I could hover over him, nurse him, and win back his love. I was succeeding when a detective came to the house one day. After he left, a change came over Mr. Brigham. He struggled up from his bed, weak as he was from the morphia and Hanyadi water I had been giving him. He ordered me away, saying, "I want you to leave this house at once." I have now since learned that the detective was Detective Patterson, and he said to Mr. Brigham, "Be careful of that woman, or she will poison you." It then flashed upon him how 3 members of his home had died in my care within a year or 2. I was frantic. Everything was lost. I thought, my lover, my future home I had counted on, fortune, and worst of all, I was discovered.
I love how she's the victim in all this, right?
Yeah. She paints herself out as, I can't believe this happened to me.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. So later that afternoon, Owe has now banished her, says, "Get out of my house." She goes to her room. She takes out the hidden poison and took just enough to make it appear that it was an overdose. We know from hearing this story, she knows exactly how much to give to kill someone, and she didn't. So I don't believe she actually wanted to kill herself. She was doing this, I think, in just another attempt to get Owe's attention.
Oh, manipulation for sure.
Yeah, 100%.
Building a defense already.
Yeah. So Owe discovers her, of course, and summons for a doctor. A doctor shows up, gives her some medicine. It makes her vomit up. And when she comes to, she's mad at Owe. She's blaming him. She's like, "Why did you save me?" Just now blaming him for saving her life, just manipulating the situation. They leave her alone, and she takes out more hidden poison and does it again. Obviously, it does not work. But now she's out of the house, and she ends up being committed to Lowell General Hospital for care. Now we remember that there's a Detective Patterson who is following her. He's staying at boarding houses near where she's residing at Owe's house, and he's underneath a different name. So he's following her. He's watching her movements. Jane gets admitted and goes into the hospital. He gets himself admitted into the hospital so he can continue to watch Jane.
Yeah, she's back in a hospital where she's murdered many people before.
Yeah.
She's like Candyland for her.
Kind of, yeah. So while all of this is happening, back in Katamet, they're exhuming the bodies of the Davis families.
For autopsies, they're going to like check them out?
Yeah, exhuming the bodies. They're like, we're going to do an autopsy. And the district attorney discovers arsenic in their stomachs, in their bodies. It's confirmed. They've been murdered. So the district attorney goes to the Barnstable courthouse and has an arrest warrant issued for the death of Minnie Gibbs. They would continue to build evidence against Jane for the murders of Alden, Genevieve, and Maddie. But for now, they would just start with getting justice for Minnie Gibbs. That's who they're kind of focusing on right now. As the warrant was being issued, Jane left the hospital and went to visit a family friend, George Nicholas, and his sister in Amherst, New Hampshire, right down the street from us. It was October 23rd, 1901, when General Whitney, Detective Patterson, and 2 local police officers from Nashua took Jane Toppan into custody, and she was taken to the Barnstable jail. Later, Jane went on to admit that, "I might have killed George Nicholson and his sister at Amherst, New Hampshire, if I had stayed long enough, but Detective Whitney came to the house that night and took me away."
So nonchalant about it.
I would have killed him.
Yeah. I would have taken out the trash.
I would have killed him.
Once Jane was brought in front of the judge on October 31st for the murder of Maddie Davis, Jane pleaded not guilty. During the entire trial, Jane stood by her plea. She insisted that she was innocent. December 6th, Jane pleaded again not guilty for the murders of Genevieve, Alden, and Maddie. While Jane was being held in the Barnstable jail, the prosecutors were struggling to actually pin these deaths on Jane, because after the arrest warrant was filed, and it was believed at that time and put into action, they thought that she murdered them with arsenic. But the coroner then tells them arsenic is in the embalming fluid. So they're like, oh shit. Like, we can't say that she killed him with arsenic because that's going to be the defense attorney's defense.
I almost asked that because arsenic, and I was like, oh, that didn't sound like something she had been using.
Yeah, she was using morphine.
Yeah. All right.
Right. Arsenic wasn't something that she was known for, although it is said that she used cyanide for one of her victims, but predominantly she used the morphia, atropia, and the hayati water. Those were kind of her three go-to poisons for her victims. So the attorney is kind of saying, we have to find a way to pin this. We know it was her. We can't say it was arsenic, but they end up going back and digging more. They're not giving up. And they go back and they do more testing and more testing. And then that's when they find the morphine and the atropia in the systems of the victims. And now they can tie all of them together, which then leads to them looking even further back. Let's look at these other victims that have died in her care. And they go back, they find all that connection. So that is how we get to the 11 count of victims.
I can only imagine, like, just unraveling that slowly. Another one. And like, yeah. Oh.
So while Jane was being held, she had a cousin, Jeanette Snow, who came forward and did an interview with a local paper, the Boston Herald. She provided some juicy details that the papers ate up. She told them all about how Jane Toppan was actually born Honora Kelly and the abuse and the neglect that Jane and her sisters endured while living with her father. She told her how her father had been committed to an asylum and was insane. She told stories of how she visited Jane's sister Nellie in the mental asylum, and she said if Jane had committed these crimes, it was because she was crazy. Once the information about her family's mental health came out, the court decided that Jane needed to be evaluated by an alienist. That's what they actually called psychiatrists back then, was alienists. So this kind of takes a turn for the court and how they're going to proceed. So Jane's lawyer, he's appointed to the case, and he realizes now that this case is going to be much more intensive. It's more hours, and he petitions the judge, I need some help. Can I get some more people on? One of those people that end up joining the team was attorney Fred Bixby. He goes and he meets with Jane. This meeting takes such a turn. He was not expecting it. It was here when he met her in January that Jane confessed to all of her crimes. And not only did she confess, but she went into details that left Bixby speechless. He claimed to have said, Jane, you must be insane. In which she responded, insane? How could I be insane? When I killed those people, I knew what I was doing wrong. When asked if she had remorse, she said, no, I have absolutely no remorse. She explained that at the times she couldn't recall what she had said or done, and that only sometimes her memory was good. Now, I know how I feel about this because honestly, I think this was just another manipulation that Jane was pulling over the eyes of those she had to convince her story to. Do I think that she was in her right mind? No. I mean, obviously, she's a sick killer, and I don't know that she's certifiably insane, though. I think she was able to stand trial. She knew what she was doing. She was capable of making decisions. I don't buy that she was insane. I think some people are just evil.
Well, I mean, if you are insane or have some type of, mental disability, like, do you know you're like crazy if you're doing it? Do manic people, when they're in a manic event, can they like recognize they're in a manic event? I don't know. I mean,
she sounds like she was a true sociopath. I mean, about 1% of the American population has the genes to become a sociopath. I know 1% doesn't sound like much, but
way more than I want.
Yeah. Under 1% of the U.S. population serves in the military, so that gives you kind of a sense. So chances are one of us in this room, I'm not going to name any names, is predispositioned to be a sociopath.
Why is everyone looking at me?
What? I didn't say anything.
It's the Irish.
But predisposition does not mean it's going to happen. The much better indicator of somebody becoming a sociopath or becoming violent is child abuse. So she was predispositioned for this mental health diagnosis. But because of her childhood, because of her upbringing, brought this diagnosis to life.
Well, I'm also going, this is 124 years ago. But in today's definition of being declared insane and incapable of standing trial, it's because you don't have the cognitive ability to comprehend what you did and to understand what is happening in the trial. So I guess in today's version, Jane knew. And I still think Jane knew what she was doing wrong, because when she tried to commit suicide, I say that with air quotations, she literally says part of her statement was, everything was lost, I thought. my lover, my future home I had counted on, fortune, and worst of all, I was discovered. So she knew. That was the worst part. Not losing the love of her life, not losing her home, being discovered.
Yeah.
She was caught. That, she literally says, and worst of all, I was discovered.
If this happened today, I think she would be found incompetent to stand trial. She'd be held and spewed to secure psychiatric unit for the rest of her life, which is basically prison with psychiatrists. But I don't think she would ever get out of prison.
Well, once her lawyers heard this, they went to the prosecutors and proposed to have Jane evaluated by a team of psychiatrists to determine her mental health. The team was made up of 3 experts in the field at the time, and after meeting with Jane, she was diagnosed with moral degenerative insanity. Now, I had to Google this, and Google says it was a form of mental derangement in which the intellectual facilities were unaffected, but the effects or emotions were damaged, causing patients to be carried away by some kind of furious instinct.
So mentally you're there, but your emotions and everything you're feeling is so strong it makes you do things.
And you just get carried away with it and you just act out on it. So after the witnesses took the stand for the state, the defense team called the psychiatrist and they all testified that Jane was insane and not responsible for the crime she committed. So in June of 1902, the jury deliberated for 20 minutes. And when the verdict was read, I don't know if this is going to be a surprise to you guys or not, it was not guilty by reason of insanity.
You had me in the first half there. I was like, wait, what? Not guilty? Sorry.
Not guilty by reason of insanity.
Got it.
Now, some of the things that I read, Jane has interviews where she's later talking to people about how this is what she wanted because she was afraid of being sentenced to death by the gallows. But what she didn't know was, I guess at the time, the electric chair had just kind of been invented and it was sort of like the new thing. So had she been found guilty and sentenced to life, it wouldn't have been in the gallows. It would have been by electric chair.
Is gallows hanging? Is that what that is?
Yes.
Okay.
When the verdict was read, it was said that Jane laughed because, again, I kind of agree with the theory that she played into the insanity defense. That's what she wanted. And it was said that she laughed. And when she was asked if she had anything to say, people claim that they had saw a small smile slide across her face. And she replied, "I have nothing to say." It was then that the judge sentenced Jane to life at the State Lunatic Hospital, better known as Taunton Insane Hospital. Jane probably thought that this was the best scenario for her, and even up to this point, she thought she would get out and she would be free. She would tell people, they're going to let me go. I'm just biding my time here.
Manipulator tactics coming in, right? Like, I'm going to control my situation.
The reality of her situation didn't really hit her until about 2 years into her sentence when her mind seemed to fully go. Prior to being in the insane hospital, Jane had been sitting in the Barnstable jail, eating plenty of food, being treated with respect by the jailer and his wife, taking part in conversations of everyday life going on outside the walls of her cell, to now living in a hospital where her world was far different. She was surrounded by patients just as evil and mentally as well as she was or pretended to be. The people in charge of caring for her believed that psychotherapy, water, or shock treatments were methods to heal her. When she was first there, she was allowed to mingle and interact with the other patients. However, this was short-lived for Jane. She used to taunt the attendants and shout out, "Hey, dearie, grab some morphine and we'll go out into the ward, and you and I will have a lot of fun watching them die." As time passed, she began to have mental breaks where she would attack other patients and the staff. She would have fits where she claimed to see spirits attempting to set her bed on fire. Eventually, this led to Jane being isolated and kept in a straitjacket. She began to refuse to eat and drastically dropped weight from over 200 pounds to a low 60. Can you guess what her biggest fear was?
Being poisoned?
Her biggest fear was that someone would poison her food or drink.
Yeah.
Do you think she's actually lost her mind a little bit and all this was happening? Or was this her playing into it again, trying to still control the situation in a way? Like leaning in deep?
I kind of think that at this point, she's now in a facility where they're saying you're mentally unwell. And our methods to cure you is electroshock therapy.
So they're doing these things.
They're doing damage. I mean, whether someone, there's cases people go in there and they don't come out or they go insane just from being in there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think she probably had a mental break at that point. And then she's being isolated. So now she's just alone. I mean, imagine, Sean, not to kind of call you out, but you live alone. If you spend too much time alone, how deep can you get into your own thoughts? And you're a healthy, mentally stable person.
Oh, thanks. Chris, shut up.
But if you spend too much time alone, I think I do. I work from home and I'm home during the day. And if I spend too much time isolated, kind of feel down and depressed, okay, she had all those bad upbringing things happen. And now she's electric shock therapy. And now she's afraid she won't eat. And she's around people who are acting erratic. Not a very good environment to be in, I think, for anybody. So
I'm trying not to have empathy for her just because, like, I don't think the circumstances of, like, electroshock therapy and probably all the other messed up things they were doing to those people there is, like, even close to helpful. But, like, I have to keep reminding myself, like, dude, she murdered hundreds of people. Like, don't have empathy.
But it's hard. It's hard not to, though, right?
But also, think about it. She used to torture her patients, and now she was a patient being tortured. Yeah. It came full circle.
Again, right? So Jane went on to live at the hospital until the age of 81 when she died on August 17th, 1938. The staff at the hospital, who knew her at the end of her life, found it hard to imagine Jane as the once vindictive, jealous, manipulative, cold killer who admitted to taking at least 31 lives, but it is speculated it was more in the hundreds. In the end, she became a quiet old lady who quietly would sit among the other patients. And during her time at the hospital, it's shown on the hospital records that Jane had only 2 visitors, her doctor, and for a very brief period, her childhood friend, James Murphy. I could find nothing about him. So I don't know how long he visited her for. But since no one came to claim Jane's remains, she was put to rest in an unmarked grave in Potter's Field in the Mayflower Cemetery in Taunton. And in the end, it looks like karma came back and took what was owed.
Oof. Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
Sad story.
I felt really bad for her. And like you said, you feel bad for her. But then she just becomes really horrible. It comes back to this sad treatment that she's getting in the hospital. And to know that she dies alone, you can't help but think, had that little girl went to a home, even if she was an indentured servant, maybe they just weren't so abusive and horrible to her. Maybe they treated her with some kindness and empathy and showed compassion. Like, maybe her life could have been different.
Yeah.
I think both things can be true, right? She's a horrible person for the crimes that she committed, and the awful things that she did, and the loved ones she took away from so many families. But there's still a sadness, and I don't want to be so cold-hearted to not at least acknowledge the fact that someone died, and there wasn't anybody to go and claim her body. Like, not one person loved her.
She could have had a sister if
she could have.
She didn't kill her.
No, she definitely could have, right? Which is just sad. It's sad. It's just a sad story.
It really is.
I mean, it's so clear that she's a product of her environment and her upbringing and her abuse. And the real bad guy is a really fucked up society.
Yeah, and then definitely I think a broken system back then, right?
Yeah.
I mean, she was literally sold off to Jane Toppan. The facility that was supposed to make sure she went someplace safe was like, nah, take her, a little child, not even 10, make her your servant. I know a lot of people who have been abused, neglected, went through trauma, and they don't end up going and killing people.
That you know of.
Well, I suppose. I suppose. But to use that as an excuse of like, oh, I had this horrible upbringing and now I'm a horrible person. Justifies why. Well, that's not always the case for everybody.
Yeah.
It's no measurement of mental health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society.
She shouldn't have become a serial killer, but God, she didn't really have much of a chance, right?
Yeah. I mean, the odds were against her.
Yeah.
For sure.
Not being treated like a person. Did she start to see people as experiments, as not other people? You know what I mean?
Well, if we only could time travel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Damn.
So, unfortunately, that's the sad story of Jane Toppan, and I don't have a whole lot more to give.
Yeah, as weird as it sounds, I still feel bad for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, she murdered hundreds of people.
Yeah. I mean, I feel bad for her. I mean, I think it's sad, her upbringing and the way her life ended. But I also think, too, that can come from a place because we know that, like, the Taunton Insane Hospital, the treatment of those patients, we know were so horrific. And really, they were just as bad as Jane. And that was named to advance medicine. And it's sad. It's a sad story that just happened.
This is the first female serial killer that I've like heard or learned a lot about. I'm sure there's others out there, but I just want to say that this is really messed up. So you women might not be as frequent as serial killers, guys, but gosh, you think shit through.
Do you know the difference between a male and a female serial killer?
What's that?
A male will kill at random. A female will get to know their victims, get close to them, and then kill them.
Usually I like to try to leave these episodes on a little levity, but I don't think there's any room for that here today. This was a heavy one, but definitely interesting and one hell of a journey and one that definitely makes you think a little bit. Thanks for sharing it. Thank you.
Yeah, the story was very well told. Thank you for sharing that with us. And it brings, it's like, where do we blame the person and where do we blame society? And that is kind of ringing in my head as we finish up the story.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to try my next story to be a little bit more uplifting and positive and fun.
Yeah, I think we need a break. All right. Well, with that, we just want to give a quick shout out to you, our listeners. Thank you so much for tuning in and for giving this a listen. I hope you know that you are amazing and we are amazing. So with all of us being amazing, why don't you share this with more amazing people out there, your friends, your family, and make sure you stop by at our Instagram at Weirder After Dark. We'll be going ahead, dropping some links, some photos from this episode and about Kathy's research. And as always, gets a little weirder after dark.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.